Javier Rivera. How are you today, sir?
Hello, Daniel. How are
Doing all right?
you?
I'm good. I am good. We're ready for baby number four, so that's going to be fun.
Oh,
And I
yes.
know, and actually, right now, or it could be at least. So immediately it'll be fun. And how are you, Mr. Rivera? And I'd be curious what you've been thinking about, my friend.
Um, Man, it's been a lot. But yeah, so I've been reading some of Simon Critchley's Ethics.
Mm,
It's a very interesting book. He's writing on Derrida, Levinas, subjectivity. Um, but I've also encountered Simon Critchley's wonderful breakdown of Heidegger's being in time as like read podcast format.
hmm,
And I was curious what you think about this in terms of this transition from Heidegger's, how's it called? Uh, at hand. Yeah, that the at hand and then the ready at hand, and then there's the present at hand.
mm,
Um, this is actually reminds me of the conversation that you brought up. This was like months or maybe a year now, who knows? Where you talked about the doorknob. When the doorknob does not function anymore, this is when the
right.
doorknob becomes apparent to us in our experience, right? We don't really pay attention to the fact that it's a doorknob until it doesn't work as a doorknob, right? But I was thinking about this transition from because Heidegger's claiming that we are immersed in the world with a familiarity. And I've gone back to my question of timing, my work on timing as a kind of phenomenology. What would that look like? And I was thinking, what if what we call timing is exactly when being becomes a problem for us.
Mm,
When because I was thinking like the question of time itself as a concept from which we experience does not become a problem for us until it becomes a question of timing. And I'm trying to consider other factors in which maybe that isn't the case, but it does seem to be the case. Time as a concept or time is something that we don't really think about philosophically until it becomes a problem of when we shouldn't do something
mm.
in our sort of everyday experience of the world. So it's interesting to me that timing is almost becomes like a, I don't know, like a meta phenomenon where we we all of a sudden are thrown out of our familiarity because we're like, well, wait a second. So we don't usually question when or we shouldn't do things, but we start to question things when some situation throws us out of time. And time in this sense would probably be analogous to our familiarity, our everyday experience. When shouldn't I say something? When should I do something? I'm in a strange situation. Yeah, that's what I've been thinking about.
Magnificent, and Michael, good to see you. I strongly agree. There is a major difference to speak of time and to speak of timing. There's a weird way in which time is a way of speaking about time that's spatial. It's just kind of
Mhm.
there and it's kind of non-contingent. But when you talk about timing, now you're talking about time temporally, which is very odd. And you could almost make an argument that every time we use a word, we use it primarily in a way that suggests space or a way that primarily suggests time, and that we don't always realize that that's in the background of our speaking. It's almost impossible to speak in a manner that does not suggest either the primacy of space or the primacy of time. And problematically, language is more naturally situated to suggest the primacy of space, which, of course,
Mhm.
for people like Alfred Korbánsky and Leibniz and others, this is an issue. Like there's this movement, and that gentleman at Voicecraft on grammatology was speaking about this. There's this movement of never using to be language, almost always using verbs, always using words that suggest movement. Because, and also, Korbánsky beautifully said that identification was a kind of mental virus. Because when we come to believe we can identify something, then we think we can make it stable. And this is false. He was much more in favor of language that basically removed, well, A is A, because A is identification. A is A is also
Mm.
problematic because that is anti-time. It is always A. What you identify is always the case, right? But what Korbowski in Science of Sanity, and he linked this problem to sanity. Literally, if you did not think more temporally, you would have mental illness problems. He thought identification, which was always lurking semantically in our language, which suggested the primacy of space, was at risk of making us mentally ill. And he kind of opened Science and Sanity, going, a lot of people are going to critique me as making a big fuss over something that's no big deal. But he's like, we do become our words. The way we speak changes what we are. That, literally speaking poetry or using poetry will change the kind of subject you are, right? And so he's like, yeah, it really matters if you use a language that is constantly reinforcing the dominance of space over time. And even and Jason, good to see you. And even the very idea that time is a word that actually becomes spatial and becomes what we primarily use versus timing in of itself suggests the kind of slick and sneaky way a background metaphysics is assumed that actually makes stable states, primacy, non-contingency, regularity, etc., primary in our thinking versus something more contingent like timing, right? We do it and don't even realize it, right? So Korbowski was all about breaking up identification for a language that was much more situational, much more flow and stuff like that. But here's the funny thing. I mean, what you're saying about philosophy starting with a realization of timing, of contingency, not being something given. For me, this very much is what David Hume is talking about, where the philosophical journey begins when something breaks. And for David Hume, it starts. And I think when you're talking Heidegger's at hand versus, at present, for me, at present, and again, I might be misspeaking when I speak of Heidegger here. Most things are at hand, we use them, but then when we reach
Mhm.
for them at hand, they break and suddenly they're present. Now they're
Right.
at present. They disclose themselves to us, right? And so we all mainly start off with things at hand. And for another way to view that is this is what David Hume means by common life, aspasia, complete delight. And so we start our life with most things being at hand. And it makes sense because when you're a kid, your parent is doing a lot, you're not really responsible for logistics. So even if something goes wrong, you may not even know it goes wrong because you're just playing, right? Your mode is playing. But then something happens where what is at hand breaks. And there's a realization of, oh, things don't always go the way I thought. Or there's a realization that what I thought was good actually may not be good. And for David Hume, that's the beginning of the philosophical journey. And really philosophy begins in the moment. And certainly you can overlay it with psychoanalysis and thinking about the subject. It overlays with when something breaks. And you realize it's possible to break, right? But then this creates a certain separation from you from what broke, because what can I trust now, right? So there's also a way which some of the things that David Hume talks about is the moment the philosophical ascent begins, you're at risk of never trusting again or never having relationships again. Because if the things you trusted could break or not go the way you thought or were not constant, well, what if it happens again, right? So he talks about the beginning of philosophy, which I would associate with your point, Javier, and then I'll pass it to whoever wants to speak. Philosophy
Mhm.
begins with the realization of timing, not space, and not time as a solid construct, but realizing that the moment, the time, there's a time to be a child and there's a time to be an adult. There's time to do X and there's time to do Y. Oh, but that means you have to discern and judge when and where. So there's an active component of judging, right? And that's really difficult, right? And so to associate philosophy with timing, but again, this is the issue. David Hume warns, and then I'll give it to Michael. Once you realize things can break, and so the philosophical journey begins because you start asking why questions or how questions. That's also when philosophical resentment can begin. You start resenting where you came from. You begin resenting common life. You resent people for setting you up. And David Hume's like, no, they didn't set you up. They just had norms and assumptions that they required to function that they themselves just are assuming and operating by because life is demanding and nature's out to freeze you to death. So you're trying to create things that work that don't always work. And, dad comes home and doesn't know how to deal with his emotions and stuff blows up or something, right? So he's like, it's really important not to get resentment. But then the other thing is, David Hume says philosophy then can turn into philosophical melancholia, where you feel depressed because you're, and actually, I think when David Hume talks about melancholia, he is talking about the meaning crisis. He is absolutely identifying the meaning crisis as being the philosophical, as a result of a philosophical consciousness. And it is, because you find yourself separated. You're not sure, what does it all mean? Can I trust anything? And you can't return to it. But David Hume also notes, as we've talked about before, without philosophy, you have no self-defense. So philosophy sets you up for risks of resentment, melancholia, and it also makes a realization of contingency, which can make you anxious. But without philosophy, well, what Hume talks about is the king coming along or the Pope or whoever telling you what's true, and now you're manipulated. So you need philosophy as self-defense, but that self-defense, to gain it, comes at a risk of not being able to re-embed into a common life that you defend, right? So we could put it in Heidegger's language, and I'll give it to Michael and then Javier. Once the thing at hand breaks, and it becomes at present to you, there's the risk of never getting back to at hand, right? But if you could get back to at hand, the very experience of the presence breaking through may actually bring about a higher experience of the thing at hand, like the doorknob. You may see it in all of its beauty. Its contingency may actually bring out its beauty or bring out creative possibility of it, right? Because now that you know it can break, well, guess what creativity does? Creativity breaks the everydayness into new possibility, right? So that's the funny thing, is breaking away from the at hand, which can be overwhelmingly anxious and cause melancholia, is also a mental move that's important for opening up creative possibility. But creative possibility can eat you alive inside, right? If you're not ready for it, or you use it to escape yourself. Because if you become creative, you can also be self-deceptive. So everything is double, but all of that, the very fact that everything is a multiplicity as such, I think speaks to your point of timing being so primary. Because here it's good, here it's bad. In this proportion it's good, in this proportion it's bad. Timing, timing, timing. But timing is a life of skill and discernment, and always being aware of the changing condition. And that's quite difficult. And then we can long to go back when things are just stable in that hand. And that's where nostalgia can come to mind in various forms of tyranny. And Mr. Jockin, good to see you, sir. But let me give it to Michael. Michael, please, it's good to see you. And I enjoyed your live stream on Plato's Cave, sir.
Oh, thank you, thank you. Excuse me. Um, yeah, I think one thing that occurs to me too, if like you really sense into what time is that um, it comes with it the confrontation of death as well, death and rebirth and that cycle. Like if you're only looking at space, kind of, you know, temporality fades away. And I think then that kind of breeds a certain sense of complacency. Because I think once you really understand the, you know, the fact that nothing lasts, that breeds a real gratitude and a real presence. And I think that is like a balm to the meaning crisis for a lot of people. So like the kind of awareness of time and the fragility of time. Um, I think that really does breed creativity. Like, you know, like I've just been like, there's just like be random times when I'm thinking about I watched the Bob Dylan um uh biopic, and you know, just thinking about like the world at that time in the 60s, and like, you know, everything that was happening with the Vietnam War, with, you know, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Cold War, um, everything that was happening domestically with, like, you know, all of these like different movements that were coming up, and like how that bred the kind of music of the age, and you know, Bob Dylan kind of being a son of like that time, and just like there was such an awareness of time, you know, like, and you know, you listen to music from the 60s and you like immediately know it's from the 60s. Like, isn't that funny? And like, you know, so a lot of musicians talk about today where like there isn't really like like kind of like a sound of the age. Like it's very kind of fragmented. And people are like, you know, like 20, 30, 40 years from now, like will we even know, without knowing when this music came from, that it came from this era, right? And I think that might point to like a loss of like a shared sense of time, and like a shared, like I think like as soon as you are aware of time, that allows you to kind of build a shared cultural narrative, because you're aware of like the the like the things of the past that have influenced the present, and where you are, kind of to invoke like, John's language, like around the imaginal, and like where you're pointing towards the future. Like all of that has to come with an awareness of time. Um, so I don't exactly know what, because I came in after Javier started, so I don't exactly know like where he was kind of pointing to with like the timing and the time distinction, but just thinking about language around time versus space. Yeah, I thought to offer that, and just the, you were mentioning like when things break, they become present to you. I Daniel and Aspasia, you might know if you were watching my live stream yesterday, I was cleaning a bowl and it shattered in my hand and it sliced two of my fingers open, and I had to get stitches on them last night. And that was a really traumatic and painful experience. Um, and I don't think I've like crested the hill of being able to like look back on it with gratitude of like, oh, I'm so grateful my fingers normally work until that. But like, I think it is a, like, it is kind of an astute point of like, when your car's running fine, you take it for granted. And then the second, you get a flat tire and you have to replace it, or like you have to do your oil change, or like something, something breaks, you're like, oh wow, like it's actually kind of a miracle that this thing like just normally works. Like all these different parts, the pistons and, the engine, and like all these things kind of coalesce. It's like it's actually kind of miraculous that that normally works. And so I think, like I remember learning from Vervaeke that like the etymology of the word horror like comes from like religious awe, like kind of the, like the moment things break and there's kind of this confrontation of like kind of the horror of it, like the horror of slicing your fingers open is like kind of when you have the awe of like, and I think the awe comes from the appreciation of um I don't know, like how the miracle of life, like, it's kind of the thing, you can only know something and its opposite. It's like when something breaks, then you really know what it's like to have it work. But yeah, I'll pass it back.
No, that's magnificent. And as first off, I think it is very astute to connect our ability to locate time with cultural artifacts. It makes me think of festivals and religion and holidays. If it's Christmas, no one has it. Is it December? Yes, it is December in the United States of America. One does not think, oh, Christmas tree, it's August. No, unless you left it out because you're 70 and you experience time so quickly that there's no reason to put the Christmas ornaments up because it will be back around. And as I've gotten older, I've appreciated all the older people I knew who never cleaned up their Christmas decorations because it came around so quickly. That's like, what's the point, right? For them, because time was so much faster. But anyway, there is a way where we associate festivals and cultural items and art with periods of time. And there is something to be said about if a society is struggling to develop testaments to its time, then it's probably moving in the direction of space and non-contingency and non-conditionality versus timing, which would suggest it is in the direction of systemizing artificial intelligence and programming, which is not exactly a good zeitgeist for the perpetuation and continuation of the human race. Humans are found in timing and contingent. We are human in those moments that cannot be repeated and those things where you just had to be there. Like, isn't that something that people talk about, say, the 60s or the 70s? Well, you just had to be there. Or a Bob Dylan concert, like, he's good. No, you just had to be there. There's something about the human that is lost when we lack moments in which we can say, you just had to be there. But of course, just had to be there is on the side of contingency and timing and conditionality. And then I think what's critical, funny enough, there's this interesting kind of irony. The more an age has things occur where you just had to be there, the more it seems that its art, its music, and its culture takes on a definite quality that points to its distinction. So here's the funny thing. The more your life is full of moments that you can only get by having to be there, oddly, it becomes more timeless. And this is, I think, kind of a secret where if you get good at timing or you honor timing, you actually enter into timelessness, which seems odd, but like timelessness, because timelessness is the fullness of time, not the absence of time, but the presence of a higher quality of experience. And timing is actually a testament to higher qualities of experience. And if you manage to hit the timing, because Javier has a philosophy of timing versus just time, and saying that often we talk about time, but oddly, it's not really time unless you're talking about timing, because time is a stagnant spatial word, funny enough. And so, but the point is that the better we get at timing, the more there's actually something timeless to our experience. So it's a C.S. Lewis first things first principle. If you put timing first, you also get this kind of timeless fullness of time, non-contingency. But if you put space and non-contingency first, you lose both, actually, in a very, very odd way. I think also, and I'll give it to Javier here and Mr. Luber, good to see you, sir. Miss Javier was mentioning ethics, and as you were speaking, I think there is something interesting about thinking about timing and ethics together, which, of course, virtue, as distinct from ethics, is big on timing and particular habits that make you ready for the moment. Because there's a way in which when we say, it's hard to say a bowl is bad or good, right? That seems kind of odd, right? And there's all these issues of, well, it's good when it's using its purpose, it's fitting, it's telos, and different things. There's another way too, which one could perhaps say it is good when the timing of the bowl corresponds with its use, but when you touch a bowl and it shatters, it's bad timing. So the timing is bad. Therefore, it is bad. And I do wonder if the language of timing can lend us to thinking ethics, which of course would go on Aristotle's virtue and different things, more so language, because we often ask, is it good or is it bad? And often we will say, well, it's bad for the bowl to break. But really, it's almost like your timing is off for engagement with the bowl. When it breaks, you slice your fingers on, but maybe a broken bowl is good because you can use it in an art piece, or maybe you had too many bowls and now you're going to throw one away. Maybe you could use the shards for self-defense or something, right? So it's really timing of the break and timing of your relationship to it that then makes it good or bad, right? And so timing ethics is something interesting to consider. But let me pass it on to Mr. Rivera. And again, I do think there is something profoundly connected about timing and philosophy. But Mr. Rivera, please.
Yeah, I mean it's because I've been rethinking, some of my philosophy on timing, because originally, I guess because this is my search back into Heidegger, where timing I usually looked at as a kind of a value question, right? When people talk like there's a Nietzschean response to this where you can say, well, timing, when people talk about timing, like, oh, when should I ask a girl out or something, right? When's a good time to do it? It's like the Nietzschean response would be like, well, you value the reason why you're concerned with this question is because you value being accepted. And it's precisely why you already have a concern with the idea of timing. So it's a value problem, not a timing problem, right? So and Nietzsche could easily respond by saying, like, this is a valuation problem, right? This is a problem of value. When you say, when's a good time to ask my parents for something, it's because you value hopefully getting, your time to play outside. So that's the only reason why you become concerned, because you really want to go outside. So it's a desire, and so on. So there's that response. But then I was like, well, Heidegger really doesn't look at it that way too much, because it's about the way we experience the world. And it's only when something becomes a problem to us that suddenly we start to ask, well, when is it a good time to do this? I've also been thinking of, this is this is obviously a vulnerable thing to share, but I think it's necessary to share. My dad is in the hospice, and I've been thinking about the phenomenology of mourning, and it's very fascinating to me in the sense of, I've been thinking about when people talk about, oh, it comes and goes in waves. And why is that the metaphor for it comes and goes in waves? And I've been thinking, because I've been looking at myself, and it's still related to timing, which is interestingly enough, which is this idea of when I ask myself, okay, am I in a position to take more responsibility, to take on the stress of daily life, and so on? And it's those moments where it's like, well, grieving can fool you if you don't take it as seriously as you should take it, meaning that there's moments in your life where something is happening and you're like, oh, well, I feel okay. But then all of a sudden, like 2 hours later, you're crying. You know what I mean? You're like, previously you were like laughing with your friends, having a good time, and then like, the next day it's like horrible, and then you're like, wait a second, I thought I was doing good. I thought I was handling this well. I thought I was, and it's one of those things where it's like, well, the metaphor of moving on doesn't seem to really be adequate. The language of moving on doesn't seem to be adequate to explain the grieving process. Maybe I'm wrong, but this idea of like being caught in the eye of the storm maybe makes more sense. It's really interesting that the eye of the storm is the very position where you can be fooled in the sense that the storm isn't coming. You're like, oh, it looks perfectly fine outside, but it's so still that you should be questioning whether actually the worst storm is about to come. you know? So it's those things of timing and making sense of grief in relation to timing. And also this weird thing of like, is there a good time to grieve, so to speak? Is there ever a wrong time to grieve? Or is that even the framing that we should ask? And I think if I were to connect, this is on the spot, if I were to connect grieving to timing, it would almost be like timing itself. The question of timing seems to be actually a sort of mode of grieving. When you have been thrown out of the familiarity of your life. And so I'm connecting it to Michael with this idea of death. And I'm connecting it to, my father in the hospice of all of a sudden it's when you're thrown out, and yet this is when you are the most in time. But I'll leave it there.
Magnificent, and thank you for sharing that, Javier. That last thing you said, I strongly agree with. Philosophy, and this is also, so there's a philosophy that begins with a certain, oh, it's interesting, oh, it's nifty, that can lead to a certain poisonous, hobbyist, or academic, dare I, overly academic philosophy. And then there's a philosophy that is what you find yourself doing or having to do after a break, where something broke. And then you're like, I didn't know things could break. Oh my gosh, what else could break? And how do I deal with things that break? And what are things if they can break? And who am I if I can cause them to break or be submitted to breaking? And then suddenly the whole world discloses itself in a different way. And this, again, I just really like David Hume's framing, because he's like, you're born into a common life. You experience your common life, and philosophy begins when something breaks in the common life. And it can be someone dies. It can be a religion takes advantage of you. A religion gives you answers that aren't there. The king sends someone off to war, and then you find out the war wasn't even honorable. It was just political manipulation. Something breaks. Now, I like to associate this where you are immediately at risk of Hecuba, as Martha Nussbaum talks about. And Hecuba goes off to war in the ancient play, and she comes back, and she had her best friend looking after her child, who she trusted more than anyone in the world. And as she comes back in the ship, she sees a body in the water and realizes it's her son, that her best friend had stolen the money, murdered the son, and didn't even give him a proper burial. And she goes, nothing is trustworthy, nothing is trustworthy. And what the play is about is how, because she doesn't trust anything, she's stuck in the broken, but not able in a way to move on the philosophical journey, which is risky. She kind of devolves into an animal, because human beings who can't trust anything become animals, or we atomize, or we separate, right? And yet, critically, Hecuba is kind of not nuts, right? If your best friend kills your son and steals the money and doesn't even get a burial, should you trust anything? Well, should you trust anything? That's a philosophical inquiry, right? And so once trust is broke, which may not even be someone betrays you, it could just be trust in reality. You know, a bad thing happened randomly, an earthquake, someone died, someone got sick, right? So you lose trust in being almost. But if you don't regain trust or figure out a way to sublate it, well, then you will become an animal, or your life will be well, it will be auto cannibalism is a term that I like to use, as you know, and that's what we see in Hecuba. And many Greek plays can be Aspasia, always a pleasure, and many Greek plays can be seen as this tension of tragedy, trade-offs of competing goods, or finding out that reality can break. And what now, right? Because if you don't figure out what to deal with it, you can become an animal. So it's a very serious matter. And I do think the quality of philosophy that comes from the break or the realization of the break is very different in character from mere hobby and interest. What you were saying also on waves, I think this is where timing is very important, because like the idea of moving on, right? You really don't move on. There's a sense in which there are times when the memory comes back. It just comes back, right? But this is where it's consequential, because if you think I should move on, it would be wrong not to move on, then you'll feel like you're doing something wrong if the feeling comes back, right? But if you understand that reality is a kind of flow of time where things come and go and they come back and they don't come back and then they do, the question is simply one's preparedness for the return. Not, it's in a sense, you could almost say sometimes in those situations where there's a lack of preparation, you fall into guilt. Like guilt can sometimes be evidence of a lack of preparation, right? Now, it depends on what we mean by guilt. Sometimes guilt, if you say kill someone, is not actually a bad thing. And in that sense, perhaps you were not prepared to not carry out the action of murder. But there's some sort of relation sometimes between guilt and preparedness that is somewhat interesting, that would have to be expanded on. But really, there's something about where reality, it's your timing of things, and then reality has a timing of its disclosure that's underneath. It's like almost two levels of timing going on, right? And your ability, it's almost like your timing needs to meet reality's timing, the world's timing. Like you're ready to deploy some of the resources, mental resources or philosophical resources when that wave comes back, right? And you know how to let it wash over you, not repress, because you could just repress, but that's not the way. But then there's also something problematic where you're just at the mercy of your emotions, right? So there's some sort of some sort of proper preparation that is needed. And it's almost like timing. Maybe we could say timing in times, the times when, I almost want to say, right? So it seems as if timing has something to do with the times when the emotion comes back, how to honor it in the proper way without repressing it, but also not be at its mercy, right? And then also allowing the times to overflow you, not hiding the emotion or avoiding it, right? So maybe there's something about philosophy about figuring out or being ready for the moment where timing and the times come together, per se, maybe. And I do think the language of moving on does not speak to that. I do think the language of kind of waves, because there's a problem with waves. It's like, well, you need to calm sea. Waves are bad, calm sea are good. So if it comes in waves, it's a bad thing, right? It almost inherently has a value judgment in it. So that can be a problematic language. But I think this all points to, and then I'll give it to Michael, what you were saying with Nietzsche and Heidegger. So do we value and then experience, or do we experience to value? And I think Heidegger would say what you actually want to emphasize is experience and then timing, where Nietzsche is almost suggesting that you experience things according to your value. But there's something very interesting here, because I do think if you emphasize beauty, or there is a way in what you're saying is you need to actually open yourself up to experience, and then the surprise of the experience you make an absolute choice in, as opposed to value. Because the problem is, it's kind of like the knowledge problem. How do you choose something you don't know about, right? Well, your values are always situated within your scope of possible experiences, right? And if you don't raise your conditionality or your virtues to have more experiences, then there might be things that would be good to value that you can't value because they can't be disclosed in your experience. And an obvious example that we make all the time is beauty, right? If there are certain things you can do to increase the probability of your experience of beauty, that then you can be attracted to and choose, well, you would want to emphasize meeting the conditions for those experiences, not just overly speaking about what do you value, right? Because what you value before an experience of beauty could precisely be habits and activities that lower the probability of experiencing beauty, right? So there is something, I think, where you have to actually talk about, well, it's in a sense, it's one could say it's art and then morality, not morality, then art. And we did kind of have a paper, and I'm using art more loosely here. We did have a paper once that said it was aesthetics, then ethics. Because if you find something beautiful, you naturally take care of it and value it. Whereas if you put value first, then it becomes taste, right? That's the risk. If you overemphasize value, it just depends on what you mean. You could fall into taste, as opposed to how do I increase the probability of experiencing things that will naturally pull me into valuing, as opposed to leaving it in the realm of the ego and choice. And I think that might be a way Heidegger. So I think the question you're presenting us with is, do we value and then experience, or do we experience then value, per se? And obviously my bias is my emphasis is on increasing the scope of experience, which though is not mere novelty. That's the problem. Most people say, well, then I'll just do a bunch of new stuff and have new experiences. No, it's a depth thing. It's the depth of experience, because if you just do a bunch of different things that are novel, they're actually all kind of similar experiences. They're just novel. They're just trinkets. They're just shiny, right? What you need to prioritize is your capacity for deep experience, which we were talking about last night with Luber and Jockin, on the same thing that you can relate to in an ever deeper way. And value should come with and after and for that, not take priority. And I think actually that mindset then prepares you for what you're saying about grief, actually, because then that the experience of grief will come up, but and then the experience will come first, right? The fact that you have that experience doesn't mean, oh my gosh, am I not able to move on? You start asking value questions, right? Oh my gosh, maybe I can't move on. Maybe there's something wrong with me. Maybe I'm not respecting the merit. What are you doing? Like the experience, grief is a revelation. That experience comes first, then valuation, right? Grief is kind of a case study of what we're saying, I think. And actually, if you get this backwards, you feel guilty for grieving. Like many, especially like religious people who like, oh, why am I grieving? They might be in paradise. I feel bad about it. Oh my gosh, maybe I don't really believe in it. You start going nuts, right? So actually, there's something about making sure experience goes first so that you don't devolve into mental chaos, right? Or all these problematic things. So the experience comes, and the fact that the experience emerges in of itself does not necessarily say anything about values. It is just the nature of a reality that is the times and timing versus stagnant. But let me pass it to Michael, Mr. Luber, and Mr. Jockin. Michael, please.
Yeah, a couple things. This has been really good. I think that the first thing on the point of the problem with moving on, I think that kind of gets to like, if you conceptualize grief as this process that like ends at some point by you moving on, I think you view time in a linear way, as opposed to, what a lot of Eastern traditions and indigenous traditions view time as the circular circular movement. And so the wave analogy makes much more sense in that paradigm, because there's the crashing of the wave, then there's the receding of the tide, then there's the crashing of the wave again. And it's this cycle. And if you view time in this linear way, you kind of view the journey of grief as this like straight path where eventually you'll get far enough from the inciting event that caused the grief where you can't even see it anymore. You're so far in the woods that you can't see where you started, and you've like successfully grappled with your grief now that you don't remember it anymore. And I think that's just like I've kind of, in the last couple of years, like I've become really interested with different paradigms of conceptualizing time in different traditions. And for me, the the cyclical one it just maps on better to my experience and like just how I've understood it. And then the other thing, and then I'll pass it back, is when you were talking about grief and how that like like makes you aware of the depth of your own experience. I think like the fact that we grieve is a signal of like it's proportional to how deep of a relationship we had with the thing that we're grieving. Right? Like your grief of your best friend or your parent is going to be much more profound than a casual acquaintance or even someone at work. So it's like the very fact that you grieve is a signal of the depth of your experience. And if you're if you're just kind of seeking these like novel experiences, but going 1 inch deep and 100 feet wide, like your experience of grief is not going to be nearly as profound. So I think there's like it if you look at grief that way, it's almost like it's a gift to experience it, because it means that you're the way in which you related with the person or the pet or the environment that you're grieving was deep. And I think one last thing before I pass it back, it's like that also is just so inextricably tied up with time. Like I've realized in my life, like I was just thinking as we've been talking, like the friends that I still have from college, but now we're in different places. We're uh, doing this like weird long distance friendship thing. Like when I was in college, I thought it was going to last forever. And so it's not that I was like complacent with these relationships. Like I really valued them, but I I didn't have the I didn't have like at top of mind the fact that this was going to end and like the temporality there. And I think like that kind of delayed the grief process. And it's only been kind of relatively recently when I'm like, oh wow, like, we might only see each other 2 or 3 times a year. And like, how special was it that we could do that every day when we were in college? So like to grieve, and to kind of prepare yourself for grief is also to be aware of, the temporality of things. But yeah, I'll pass it back.
No, I think that's magnificent. And, without going into it, I'm now thinking that there are probably, there seems to be grief, which has a potential love in it. But then there's something like devastation, which is like you're paralyzed because you had an over attachment you're not able to release, like you had all your eggs in the basket. There might be some sort of like, melancholia in the human. Like it's interesting to think that I think there are different words here that perhaps can be brought out because we've all like there is the person who, in a sense, can't move on, right? Something terrible happens and their life is stuck in something 20 years ago. And that seems, in a way, to be a testament to love, but then in another way seems problematic. So it'd be interesting to pull that apart because there's also something extremely problematic if, say, your child dies and you don't notice. That would be the depths of problems, right? So there's something interesting to be considered there. I think what you're saying on grieving, showing care, and I'm also thinking there is almost sometimes almost a mercy in the fact that you do have different levels of grief because if you felt grief for everything that fades, everyone who passed away, you would be overwhelmed, right? So you wouldn't be able to function. But then there is also something kind of tragic about the fact that things do fade and the quality of the relationships are not there, right? It's just interesting to think. I guess I say all of this because the words themselves, in their very struggle to adequately address what we are describing in an intense emotional experience in of itself suggests a reality of timing more than space, right? These words are suggesting some sort of relation to time because it's almost like it would be bad not to grieve when someone passed. There's a time for grieving, but then there's some point where the time almost becomes time. Well, maybe that's it, where someone who just every single day for 20 years mourns the death of their friend, it's almost like time isn't timing. It becomes a stable state. It is no longer fluctuating. It is no longer moving. They've grasped it and they've turned time into basically space because it doesn't flow anymore. It's almost like there's an issue if emotions don't have the flow quality, because then you see that sort of desperate kind of nervous happiness where people are always trying to act happy and perform and make it like space and non-contingent because they're nervous of what if someone gets mad at them if they're not happy, or what if someone, is upset, right? So I wonder here if there's something about, and this would have to be thought about, if every emotional state becomes poisonous or problematic when we try to move it from time flow into space, basically, or just continuation. Maybe that's the language, right? Like continuation. Because in continuation, the practical difference between time and space vanishes. There's still a technical difference, but practically there's not a difference anymore. It's just continual, right? So maybe there's something like every single emotion or every single experience, if we grip it and try to make it constant and make it a continuation, then it becomes problematic. When instead we need the open hand like Michelle's bird. And then grief comes, there's a natural flow to these things. And then the question is our timing to it. That is something I am thinking here. The last thing I'll say, when you were saying about time, and then I'll give it to Luber, Mr. Jockin, and Javier, I am quite partial to Bergson's notion of time, and I do think Dr. Robinson talking about time as holographic is extremely good, where all points of time contain the whole of all time. Because I do think that's how we experience it. We experience time as every moment interpenetrating every other moment. As I'm here, I'm also thinking about yesterday, what I need to do tomorrow, childhood experiences, our last talk. We experience time as an extremely pregnant now that contains an interpenetration of all points, like a hologram, where like a hologram is something where every point of information contains all the points of information of the whole, right? And that's how Bergson thought about time. And I do think that's how we can think the circle and the line kind of together. We can think how you have, it's not merely repetition in the circle, but it's a certain wholeness that has a repeating of all of the information in every single moment that you can experience, right? And then it makes sense why grief can go and then come back, because every moment contains the information of all the other moments. So any moment could invite the grief of a previous moment to come back, or joy or memory. And the question, and then of course, if every moment contains all other moments like a hologram, then the question is simply your preparation for whatever moment may primarily emerge in this moment versus another, and it's a timing and preparatory sort of structure, right? But then of course it would be very naive to think that, oh, well, I'll just repress the grief, or I'll just move on from the grief. No, you never do, because every moment contains all the information of every other moment, right? So you can't move beyond a moment that happened in time. It can always come back around, but that's not evidence of you failing to be emotionally mature. That's just evidence that you're in a holographic universe, perhaps. And so I do like Bergson's notion of time quite a bit, and I think it can be overlaid with other philosophers. Mr. Jockin, it was good to speak with you last night.
Yes, today, and we got another session tonight.
Yes, good times.
I know, good times. And Luber, if you come back, I'll yield my slot to you back if you get this in time. This is a really interesting idea about sorrow, right? Grief, sorrow. It's a really interesting part. It's very interesting. On two notes. One is Christopher Alexander talks about the quality without a name in the timeless way of building. He means beauty. He doesn't want to use the word, but he means beauty. It must have an element of sorrow attached to it. And specifically the idea that everything you're seeing in temporal existence is flowing and coming to be and going away. And there needs to be a tenor of sorrow attached to it. It's interesting because Aquinas talks about this in devotion. Then the act of devotion is two actions happen at the same time. There's a Javier, just shout out to you, because if you know the proximate versus the accidental association or cause, Aquinas talks about devotion has two parts. One part is basically an interior motion of charity, basically of surrendering oneself to the beloved, because there's some kind of goodness that they're giving to you that you're devoted to. And the other aspect is sorrow, especially the idea that you're dependent on some shortcoming, because if what Aquinas shows is that because of a shortcoming in you, you need to turn to your beloved. But the more general part is that there's something you love and are dependent on is going away. It will be removed. It's not even a possibility. It's just, it will be removed. And it's actually the great challenge of all the spiritual practices is the question of, where is your love affixed to? Temporal goods, or is it towards spiritual goods, right? The kind of ordering and priority. And that's not, it's very easy to say intellectually, very different to say in your lived experience, your parents, children, things like that. That even when you are stricken by grief, and by the way, actually, another note I said, I always find it interesting this when you get strikes of grief, it almost shows that awareness is much larger than any kind of choice or knowledge on your part, meaning that you didn't even realize how many times we've seen short narratives or experiences in our lives where a character or a person doesn't even realize the depth of a relationship, how important it is to them until they lose it, or is put to danger in some way. And like, it really strikes you that you actually, it's like, I was wrong. You get this like, it's probably the greatest horror, especially if it's an unretrievable this loss. They die, you lose it. You lose the relationship, you lose that person thing you love. And you didn't even realize how important it was until you lost it. So it almost goes to show you didn't even recognize the importance of until after you lost it. So it takes the idea of like the Heideggerian broken object model. It takes even further when you look at it that way. I just say that because, Javier, I think your notes of like when you're just going through your life and it's not even in your power of choice that you're getting nailed with these flashes. And I'm sure it's sometimes by recollection, like something reminds you of your father and that's leading you cycle through. And other times it could be completely just like out of completely nowhere. There is no action of choice. But that very act that even it gets activated by memory, but even without memory, it still happens. This is showing that something much deeper fundamental is going on. And I'm sympathetic to that part. I've had issues. I've had very significant health problems with my father for a long time. Just to share with this group, at one point, my father had a pulmonary heart attack where it wasn't getting enough oxygen. So as a result, he fainted in front of my arms, went gray, lips went blue, and I really did think he was going to die in my arms that moment. And I actually think it was very important. I remember, and it's a good example. It's funny because it wasn't even remember what I did holding my father in my arms when he was turning gray. I remember saying, I love you. That's all I said. Of course, all the grief and the kind of the pain of that came afterwards. He stabilized. He's still alive, thank God. He stabilized. EMTs came, his blood pressure and everything was normal. But that time they got in there, it was wild as an experience. And actually, it was only after everything happened that actually the horrible pain kicked in terms of what I almost lost my father and he held in my arms. You don't realize how much you love someone until a moment like that happens. To be honest, like in one sense you're supposed to because this is your father, but then there's the actual experience of a real encounter of death or the danger of it. And then you realize actually really deep to the bones what that means. So that's my point. Like and actually that's the point. And then, I say this because my father's had health issues for a long time. So I remember my father would call me or something would happen. I'd be like busy. I remember every time I would have this glimmer of thought, what if this is the last time? What if I don't answer this phone call and I don't get another chance? That's only because I've had enough experience with my father almost dying for various health conditions for a long time in my life, almost 20 years 30 years at this point, that I've had that mindset. I know if I never had that kind of experiences of death or of potential loss of my father, I'd be very easy to write that off. Like, I'll call him later because we write off time. This is a very strong point of all the traditions talk about the spiritual traditions. You do not own time. You do not own time. The hour of your death is preset, but you do not know when. They can go at any time in any way. Anything you love can go away at any time, any way. So it's actually an illusion of confidence that you think this thing will continue to persist. And that's not guaranteed. And when we suffer loss or have the danger of loss presented to us, we get reminded of that because we don't want to experience that horror of you write it off and then you got to now sit with that that reality that, well, there was another time. I think about it also with my uncle. My uncle passed away, and I still I don't remember anyone else in the room has this experience where you have a relative or someone you care about who passed away, and you have that ghost in the machine experience of their messages to you, and Instagram or whatever. I don't know if anybody else has done this, but actually, my uncle on his anniversary of his death, I go back to those messages and I write a message. No one's there, but I write a message. And I actually see it's almost a document memorial. And that's when I can't go visit. When I can't visit his grave, when I go visit New York, I do that. Yeah, it's very interesting. Anyway, so I just want to share just kind of summarize, besides me sharing that point, just to kind of bring it back to philosophy in particular. Just as its strike of awareness is much deeper than any kind of any intentional choice. And I don't think we realize the magnitude of things we care about. And that's the thing, and grief is the sign of that. I think very much. And I think the last part is just related to that. It is really a choice. The only thing that you don't get to choose the grief, but you certainly get to choose how you respond to it. At least the Daniel's your part about how you respond to it. That is true. The kind of fixation on this laws of a temporary good can define entire personalities and entire lives. So, and that really, I think that is the ultimate choice in a lot of ways. It's basically that where's the affiction from the grief and what transformations can occur. And they do occur. I'm reminded of the book, especially, I think for men, the idea for men, grief has to be from a mode of transformation. This basically, I forgot that book. It was something about swallowing the snake, something like that title. I'm forgetting the particular title. But it was basically stories of men who, in their healing of sorrow of different kinds, they usually had to do some kind of act of transformation. Memorial building, doing some building or some action in the spirit or memory or something they love and care about. That's what I have. I yield.
Magnificent. And thank you for sharing all that, Thomas Jockin. And I'm particularly struck by the beauty of the moment with your founder saying, I love you. And it is very interesting to me where in those moments of greatest intensity, the thing that one naturally or almost rightly without thinking it turns to is an affirmation of the relationship. Which then, if relations are reality, there's a way in which in that moment of most intensity, there's a simultaneous acknowledgement of the true as relations are real, the good, this choice of this relationship was good, and the beautiful, which is this strike that you brought about, or this relationship made this possibility of beauty that would otherwise not have been there. There's something about the simplicity of that notion. Well, then, of course, what's interesting, if there's traditions of God is love, or love is the most important thing, everything you're saying on grief complexifies that quite a bit, because then love is actually the realm of this depth of sorrow, actually. And the depth of sorrow is actually the realm of the highest beauty and the higher relationship. And I guess as you're saying that, Mystic Ashir, it's good to see you. This, I think, is appropriate because it makes me think of healing, because there's something very interesting where if philosophy is moving in the directions of emphasizing relation, and there's always a risk of talking about relation to avoid relationships, because relationships are where you start talking about people and the real and love and different things, then philosophy is moving into the realm of thinking the place where depths of grief are possible, right? And then those are the places where runs the risk of holding on to something too long, where you turn that defines your entire life. But to work with the beautiful, or to work with the good, or to work with these depths of relations without which we fall into the auto-cannibalism of nihilism and the meaning crisis, we must risk grief. We must risk these deep hurts, right? And so this also might suggest why psychoanalysis, things like therapy, emotional intelligence, healing, all of these things are emerging in the same ecosystem of philosophy, because the philosophy that is moving away from academic trappings into the direction of, relationships. Well, relationships are these things that if you care about, you will feel grief in their loss, and you will need to be healed from and have to figure out how to work with, and you can be deeply hurt. Like the topic of the best forms of philosophy now are about the things that if you care about can hurt you most. So it would make sense that these issues of healing and psychotherapy and psychoanalysis and philosophy and relationships all go together, because I think you said the strike of grief, and of course we have the strike of beauty. There's always this interesting thing that beauty brings a grief, right? Once it's gone, or if it's lost, right? There's always that interesting idea that many people who have near-death experiences, actually, it can ruin their lives because they get a glimpse of heaven and they go back to normal life and they're super depressed, right? There are people who can have giant visions of the glorious, and actually that becomes a source of misery to them because it's lost, right? And so there's something about beauty that in its very evanescence, if you're not prepared for that evanescence, or you have a strike of beauty before you have the capacity to also handle its going on per se, can actually be devastating. And this also might suggest why you need to actually advance gradually toward the beautiful, say through the true, then through the good. Because if you go to the beauty first, then it's passing may be too much for you. Its passing may be too devastating. That also might suggest why you don't want to get in a super intimate relationship before you've worked on yourself. Because if you jump right into a super intimate relationship before you worked on yourself, well, the fact you haven't worked on yourself probably means the relationship won't go well. And then when it breaks, you won't even have the capacity to handle the grief. And so the amount of like healing that will be needed is far deeper. I don't want to say you're damned or something, but the cost will be much higher. So there's some sort of wisdom in the timing of intensity, to go back to what Javier has been saying, to be aware that there is a timing for intensity. And perhaps philosophy, classically, philosophy has moved to the place where it's time to move into beauty, but that intensity was too scary, so it just moved to the academic. But Mr. Kashir, please.
Yeah, just on that point, and thank you so much, Thomas, for that share. So honored to join this conversation at this moment in time. Yeah, it just feels like such a profound question to approach in a philosophical space. And just already what's bubbling up for me in this conversation is that there are so many different qualities and so many different ways of approaching grief. One that's been raised is this kind of more like masculine, I guess you could call it masculine response to grief, which is like, what do I need to do to just keep moving on? What do I need to do to survive? And often that means, like building a farm or like, some like extreme continual like active project in the world can grow out of grief, which is why I mentioned Wim Hof also, who developed most of his techniques after a very severe loss of his wife. But then you also have this grief as a kind of portal to the divine. You have grief as the doorway. Grief is the opening that allows you to perceive the depths of life, and the depths, I think, specifically of religious symbolism are revealed in grief. And so, most of the inner contents of a Christian church make a lot more sense in the context of having experienced grief rather than prior to that. Yeah, and there was also a sense of, I think I also appreciate that point you just raised there, Daniel, of like, just because there is a facticity of grief in being, there's also something to be said for kind of being better prepared for the blows of life. And I agree. I think those first loves when you're young and when you haven't developed yourself are going to be more devastating. And it's really connected again to like, what are those things that allow you to survive? What are the things that allow you to navigate through? And if you've discovered, sometimes you're going to have to discover those in the midst of the grief, and that can be a huge breakthrough process as well. And maybe you just wouldn't have the drive to discover philosophy or discover the saints or discover writing music without the grief as well. So in a way, you kind of, there is no manual, and you just need to find it in the midst of it too.
Very well put. It's funny because if I would ask, can you live a good life if there's no possibility of grief? The answer seems to obviously be no. And yet, isn't that odd? Why? Why is it seem impossible to live a good life, or certainly a beautiful life, if there is no possibility of grief at all, right? And so if there must be the possibility of grief, there is something in grief that is a testament to something beautiful and good. But it's a question, I think, of timing and intensity and readiness and knowing what you're dealing with, right? If you are dealing with the highest things, you are at risk of the deepest emotions. And if those emotions are hard, then that can be very, very, very hard on you unless you are prepared for it. So very well put. I'll give it to Mr. Luber, Javier, and then Michael. Mr. Luber, please. It's good to see you, and I enjoyed speaking with you last night.
Likewise, likewise, and thank you, Javier, Jockin, and this is tough things to talk about. I think like my grandmother passed away on February 11th last year, and her anniversary has been coming up, and I've been thinking a lot about that, and it's just the funny thing is I don't know if you guys had the chance to you know, I had a lot of time to talk to her about death when she was alive on her deathbed, which was very uncanny. Um, and I think something that is a Heideggerian notion that I kind of just was like the baseline sentiment of the conversation was she meant so much to me that for me to actually have a denotation, for me to know what that meant, for me to actually process that, it has to come to an end. Like that feeling just literally has to come to an end. It's like we would talk about football, and it's like, yeah, if there's a football game, there was no fourth quarter and it just kept going, nothing would mean anything. Like the most spectacular play might feel amazing watching or playing, but like the end result will feel empty. And like I was devastated when she passed away, but there was part of me that was happy. Not that she passed away, but it's just that I'm not grieving. There's like different kinds of grieving. I feel like there's people that might grieve where it's like, I don't want to be here anymore because they're not here. Where it's like their existence doesn't matter now that they're not there, for example. And I found with my case with my grandmother, kind of the opposite, where it was she took up so much of my mental, just my capacity to love. Because I do think that if she was alive forever, my capacity to love, let's say, a future child might be diminished potentially because I still have this capacity toward her. Like, I think there's a finite capacity of loving. And I think in life that like flow where it doesn't turn into space, what you were saying earlier, Daniel, is that that capacity moves through different people. And I think that's like a necessary thing for love. Because I think if love was just for only one person, it doesn't really seem loving. Like it seems like that is like you're fetishizing, actually. And I think that I'm not saying like polygamy and all that stuff, but I'm saying like, it's like, oh, I love my wife, but not my kids. I can only love my wife. That's weird, That's like kind of fucked. But I just think, like with the Heidegger point, real quick, I just think the experience of registering the experience just needs death, like registering the meaning of it. I think that ultimately is his point. I think Nietzsche might be more not looking at it from a grand scale, but just more from that individual moment. Okay, why are you, talking about timing with the girlfriend? Like that doesn't seem like at that moment that's not what your actual focus should be on. I do think it's like hard to focus on experience itself because I don't know, it just doesn't register to me as a fruitful, you know, package to like digest in this type of context. I think what to to think about death in terms of how it's been perceived in history is very interesting. Where I think there's different narratives that aren't gone; people are aware of them. Like, oh, you go to heaven and you hold hands with everyone, potential narrative type of thing. There's different narratives that have been played out in history, and there's just, they exhaust themselves through repetition, and then different narratives, and now there's a narrative of like nothingness, you know? I think an interesting question is, what is a different narrative that isn't reduced to just a narrative that has occurred in the past about death? Because I think when people think about death, it's hard to think, and that's the problem. And I think they need a narrative to situate death in that makes it easier to think about it and process it just for your own first person emotional sake. I think that's like an interesting thing to think about, because a lot of people would process it based off of the narrative that they see death in, their grief. And I think, there's the micro narrative between you and the individual, and then the broader narrative in which that micro narrative is situated in. And but I will pass it off.
It's a fascinating question, Mr. Luber, because there is something about death that it's almost the point in your narrative where narrative takes over entirely, because death does not give you facticity beyond the moment of, up to the death. But once the death itself occurs, it's not like the death feeds you information that you can adjust your narrative according to. It's almost like your narrative is left to do the rest of the work for it, right? It almost has to be, right? And then, of course, that the issue is, if you don't have, well, people are going to create explanations. They're going to create narratives about death. The question is, are they ready to do so? Have they thought about it before? Is it located in a tradition? Are they doing it on the fly? Like people, maybe people should take Bonhoeffer's advice, and there are some of the greatest moments of life are the ones you need to be silent about. Maybe there would be a holiness in having silence before death, right? But that is not, that's a question. Maybe that's the narrative, but people are going to give explanations and narratives and stories about it. So I think that's a very interesting question you present. On the Nietzsche and Heidegger, I should note, Nietzsche may come back and say, well, if you don't, because, his big thing is saying that's basically virtuous, that's valuable versus contemptible, versus using the language of good and evil, because good is usually just the opposite of evil. It's none of your own valuing, right? And he may say, if an experience comes forth and you don't value it, then it will just go away and it doesn't even matter, right? So you have to make the choice to keep it. You have to make the choice to value it, right? But then, of course, the question is a kind of ordering thing. And, Nietzsche, the idea that the experience has to lead, but it can't be an experience that is not conditioned by you. It also has to be conditioned by your capacity for depth of experience, right? And so it's not purely experience. It's all like, it's all about the order, right? Like the order comes down. Is it like, do you emphasize the conditions for the possibility of the beautiful, which is also staying to the thematic command, of which indirectly increases the probability of the beautiful in that experience, of which then you can value and better align your wealth with. And so you stay in the thematic, and then you can have that absolute choice in the absolute letting, like we talked about last week. But the word experience, for experience sake, may not capture all of that. And this is where we have this dilemma where all things have to be held together at all times and all moments, just like perhaps a holographic universe where time is penetrating in every single moment. So all things that matter have to interpenetrate in each thing that matters, or it ends up devolved and doesn't form properly. But how does one do that? And one can look at, you could argue that was a main tension religions dealt with. It's like, oh man, how do we constantly keep people remembering all things all the time? You have to have humility, but you also have to care and charity and be magnanimous and cherish the good, and don't let your humility come into self-degradation, and also remember the parables. Oh my gosh, how in the world are people going to remember all this? Well, we have to do it every week, and we have to have community, and we also have to have small groups, and we have to do a whole lot of work. And also, too, that kind of also, and I'll give it to Javier and then Michael here, there is a funny way in which I think there's something isomorphic to the need for regular philosophical dialogue, because you can't keep all things in mind at all times and they'll slip out, right? So it's not that it has to be 24/7, but it's kind of like going back to the pharmacist, right? That if you're not careful, these things, like one part of the whole slips away, which then perverts the whole, right? And then you're overemphasizing one part versus another. Tune the instrument. That's a lovely way to put it, Mr. Tushier. And I think that kind of speaks to, well, it's also likely to run into trouble once grief occurs, once you're devastated, once you're upset, right? Like almost the test of the success of a religion is for the breaks in life, for the unexpected, right? If the religion can't handle the unexpected, it's fragile, not anti-fragile, right? I think the same goes with philosophy. I mean, like evidence, I always take as evidence for the shortcomings of academic philosophy, how many, and I use that as a catchphrase, not obviously not every philosopher, professor falls into this, but how many people who do philosophy or study for it life, once an unexpected thing occur, they leave the philosophy behind, or it doesn't matter to them, or it doesn't aid them, right? Like it's not there. That's evidence of a philosophy that was fragile, not anti-fragile, right? Like philosophy has to be in service of the breaks, not seen tertiary or irrelevant to the breaks. Like and it's those moments of the break or the grief that bring out the truth of the religion, or the truth of the philosophy, or the truth of the thought, right? Precisely in that moment. And what exactly that looks like is very, very interesting, because, say, in many religions, instead of there are different practices that could look like, but it's not usually just a simple answer. When religion started giving theological answers to people's grief, that's when it could fall into disarray, as opposed to a story, a person, a name, a practice. These seems, or community, right? Like the worst thing a religion can do is give you a theological explanation to grief when you need community or relationship, right? Same goes with philosophy. Same goes with everything. More can be said on the relation of blood and beauty and church and things. I think that's all actually quite important, because again, if you're messing with the highest things, you're messing also with the most mysterious of things like death. These things that can't easily be brought into narrative, and that forces one to consider all of these things together, which can break the brain. But if the brain doesn't meditate upon these things altogether, it runs into the risk of forming poorly. It's a serious matter. But let me give it to Mr. Rivera and then Michael. Mr. Rivera.
Yeah, no, this is good. I mean, I'm still thinking more through your distinction, which I like, between grief and devastation. Because yeah, it's weird, because you could say at the moment of this grieving process, I was tempted with a mode of devastation. In fact, I was in a state of temporary devastation, maybe. Maybe it's wrong to even say temporary, because I could be tempted again. But it's one of those things where I know enough philosophically, but when I caught myself, bounding myself up in my room for a couple of days, and I was like, I need to move. I need to go outside. I need to interact with people. I need to pray. I need to do something, because I can see the eating oneself most vividly in this process. And it seems to be that devastation is this temptation for self-effacement. And that's the really hard part, is that you can be tempted with a sort of self-effacement, whereas grieving is and maybe this is what maybe people might mean by moving on. It's just grieving is this sort of this acceptance, but doesn't quite go through a self-effacement, right? It sort of understands and tries to deter a self-effacing moment. But on this question, though, and it's interesting, because Simon Critchley's reading of Derrida is fascinating in the sense, because Derrida argues that justice should not be confined to the living, but also to the non-living, the people that are not alive or the people that are dead. And it's fascinating to me, because there's a kind of, like, what Derrida calls a kind of a hauntology, that we're haunted. And it's almost like the word haunting makes sense when someone dies. But it's this relation to our being haunted that can risk self-effacement, or it could be a proper relation to memorial beauty, the sublime, just think about the fact that religions circle around death, have rituals around death. I mean, you could say Christianity's haunted by Jesus. It's sort of by his death. And they reenact it all the time, right? In the Mass, Catholic Church reenacts this death all the time, as a kind of central force. So it's interesting that we're at the same time haunted by death, and then to kind of expand this into the Nietzsche and Heidegger thing that I brought up. It's interesting because it's like, I'm going to use some Heidegger words here, right? It's like, I don't think Nietzsche would have a problem, maybe. Like if Nietzsche were to have read Heidegger, let's just say, I don't think Nietzsche would have a problem with Heidegger saying value is not value until value itself becomes a problem. Because I think Nietzsche's fundamental critique is that you guys don't know you guys have values. You guys are unaware of the fact that what you guys are assuming, what you guys are circling your life around as a kind of moral critique of holy thou-ness is really just a predication of value that is historically contingent. So Heidegger would be almost like, I guess, re-explaining Nietzsche possibly, in the sense of there's the value that is in our thrownness, right, in the midst of being in the world, but that value of being in the world cannot really maybe qualify as a value until it becomes a problem for you. It's only when value becomes a problem for you that you actually understand what is the value that one is choosing in a mode of experience. And so in this case, being open towards death in the Heideggerian sense might be the strongest indicator for what one chooses, what one values. Now, I know a lot of people, like Simon Critchley, I think even says this too, like Heidegger, some people argue like Heidegger wasn't really concerned with ethics, and this is where, we can combine Levinas with Heidegger, and this gets a very interesting kind of addition of a phenomenology of ethics and so on of the other. But yeah, I mean, the fact that value, I mean, Kierkegaard, I think, will almost say the same thing, right? Like, just being born a Christian is not enough to say that you really know what it means. It's almost as if when you choose it, when it comes an experience of death for you. So yeah, I mean, I agree with Luber's gone. I agree with Luber here about the fact that the end, the contingency itself, is the strong indicator of what one actually values, or when value itself goes into question. Maybe that's the best way to put it. When value itself goes into question. And it's one of those things, as a real life example, my brother was telling me that he doesn't feel anything for my father. And then he calls me the next day and he's like, I am so distraught and disturbed about why I'm having all these emotions. And I was just kind of like, yeah, I mean, the problem with already, sort of presuming that one doesn't feel anything is that one doesn't know that you will feel anything until the epitome of the death comes in, right? Until the threat of contingency comes into the picture, that you understand what it is that you actually feel and what it is that you value. And also as a final thing, to elaborate on what you were talking about with that life itself presents a timing. The fact that I had to, I mean, I've always struggled with my father personally, this kind of, trying to embrace forgiveness and and so on. But it was one of those moments where, obviously my philosophical preparation helped me here, which is the fact that life, the way you presented, Daniel, and you're correct on this, life does not wait for you to come together and make sure everything is set in order with yourself and your father in order for you to then go to his deathbed. It's more like your father is dying. You haven't solved all the problems that you had, and you probably won't be able to, but you should probably see him because you don't know how you're going to feel if you don't do it. So, and it's one of those things where it's like, yeah, you have to, I don't want to call it repression, but it's like it's a kind of, I have to be beside myself, I have to push myself aside because I don't know. I don't know in the midst of the valuation whether the problems that I had, the problems that we have with our loved ones, whether they do truly matter in the end versus their actual end. And so it really puts and frames into question, and it problematizes what one should do. And it's when life gives you this very slim opportunity, either take it or don't take it. Life will take it away from you. And then you have to sort of grapple with that in your own way. And it's a sort of, it really is like a haunting in a way. It's a haunting if you don't take it. And it's a haunting if you do take it, because then you're like, oh wow, if I didn't take it, if I didn't do this, how distraught would I have been as a memory, as a ghost sort of lingering there. But I'll leave it there.
No, outstanding. Thank you for sharing all that. I'll give it to Michael, and then if anyone has any final things, please. I think it is when you speak about hauntology, it's very interesting because haunting and memory are connected as well, right? There's like this thing you can't shake off that's tied to something that occurred. It's hard to be haunted by something you can't remember or that isn't located in memory. And there is something about hauntology that does, again, speak to me with Bergson's holographic universe, where every moment contains the whole, because you kind of feel in every moment connections with the whole, and there's a certain haunting feeling. I think the memory of beauty has a certain haunting to it. The memories of the deepest relationships, there's a certain haunting to it. Maybe you say, oh, well, I think fondly upon it. Oh, that's a nice memory. But there's a way in which the word haunting is this continual coming back around. It's there in the background, and then it's there and it goes and it comes and it goes. And there is something about, we are, as primarily temporal beings that are always working with ghosts and hauntings. We are always making choices in the realm of possible hauntings and or possible orbits. Maybe a haunting is an orbit you don't like, and an orbit is a haunting you do like, right? Maybe there's different languages, but it's all very tied to memory. And it all seems to be a certain revelation of how every moment of time contains every other moment. And it's just a question of what you realize and your conditionality that makes some of the information more vivid than others. And I think the language of hauntology is very good. I think also what you're saying, you don't value something until it's problematized. I think that's spot on. I think, for me, I like to read Nietzsche as critiquing bestocentrism. I think Heidegger is critiquing bestocentrism. He's critiquing the idea of our notion of being bestowed to us versus being something that is present and encountered, right? Surprising, right? And it's absolutely true that we don't value something until we problematize that value, right? One of the reasons is because values tend to become stable. They become spatial, not temporal. They tend to move in the direction of being something given to us versus a heuristic of judging situations live, right? And also, every value can overfit. We've talked before about how often the problem is not right and wrong, it's underfitting, overfitting, right? Every single value can overfit. Every single value can be misapplied. Until it becomes problematic, you don't experience your value as finite. You experience it as infinite. But the problem with that is a potentially spurious infinity in the Hegelian sense. It's a non-contingency. Well, then your value is God. You're treating a value like God, right? Something that is always the case. right? Well, then you've kind of replaced God by a value, right? And yet you may do that in the name of God or something like that, right? So the very problematization of value and it's the same with not like you don't have knowledge until you problematize knowledge. You don't have discernment until you problematize discernment. Like every single thing has to be problematized to be itself. And I think that that's part of what's necessary to actually bring it into the situation of humbling itself before God and actually then situating it so that it can lead you to God, the beautiful, etc., as opposed to replacing it. I think the last thing I'll say and give it to Michael here is I like how you kind of phrase what you were saying. Before, I also really like beside myself versus repression. That was really good. I think that's exactly right. There's a difference between like moving beside yourself versus repressing yourself because you don't know. That's really good because because it's not a repression because you don't know. But this is where truth organizes value. This is why your view of reality is really important because if you accept that reality, life itself presents a timing, if you really understand that, philosophy can help you, like philosophy and precisely say taking ignorance seriously in a Socratic way actually makes possible a distinction between moving yourself aside and repressing yourself, right? Because you are justified to say, I don't know. So it's not a repression. Repression is more of denying what you know, but to say, I really don't know how the emotion, I don't know that I won't feel anything. It could come back around. That's actually to align with truth. Because the truth is you don't know. So it's not a repression. So that language is quite useful for this dilemma I think many people have now of not being able to tell the difference between acknowledging I don't know and repression. They're not the same. And I think the way you were outlining that is extremely useful. I think I like also this idea of being tempted by devastation and grief. I think it's interesting because I think in joy you can be tempted by triviality. I think in grief, you can be tempted by devastation. I think in beauty, you can be tempted by symmetry or the aesthetic. Every good thing oddly brings with it a temptation of its overfit, precisely because it's good, precisely because it seems fitting. Like that's what I guess that wording you presented makes me think is like the issue seems to be that everything that occurs, if it's even right to occur in that moment, brings with it a feeling of potentially overfitting it or extending it. Because it's right, because it's good, because it's the proper emotion, right? We want to keep this joy going. So let's get some shiny. Let's get some new thrills. Let's get some new novelty. We want to keep this going. There's something about like if you feel grief when you should feel grief, then you're like, well, we should keep this going, right? So then you're tempted to extend it into devastation. When you feel joy, and then you got to do, or the mysticism, and you have to do the dishes again, as that book goes that Michael brought to my attention. Then there's the temptation of, well, we ought to keep this going, right? Because it's a good thing, right? It seems to be the temptation is found in the we should keep this going, which is then in a way the temptation to turn timing into time as stable state and continuation, and then time is actually no longer time. It is just another word for space. It is space-time per se, which makes time an illusion. And so I'm wondering if a way to think about the problem is that there's the mistake of the wrong emotion at the wrong time, but then there's the mistake of overfitting or overextending the right emotion or the right way of doing things beyond its horizon. But how do you determine that? Well, this is where philosophy and all that comes back, right? But let me give it to Michael. And again, if anyone has final things, please, Michael.
Yeah, this has been really great. I've been really appreciative of everyone's shares and vulnerability and just opening ourselves to the spirit of this discussion. One thing that I wanted to mention regarding now everything's just kind of escaped my mind. Ah, shoot. But I was thinking because I've been reading Plato's Cave and I'm in a class, a poetic enchantment class, and this was the first text that we read, and we were talking about like the forcible removal of the prisoner, which I know, Daniel, you've written about at length, and I think we've had discussions on the net about it. And we were talking about like kind of the importance of that and the distinction between, the volitional journey as opposed to being forced out. And one thing that was kind of dawning on me, and this goes to what we were talking about earlier with like the strike of grief, kind of catalyzing the philosophical journey, and what you were talking about earlier with, if your philosophy doesn't hold up in these times of breaks, then how strong is it? That like I think many of us find ourselves pursuing philosophy or the arts, or depth of expression beyond just kind of the superficiality of our time through crisis. And it's not like we've just kind of been captivated by the beauty of these ideas and these thoughts from a young age. It's like we were kind of living in a state of sleep, and then we kind of get hit with the fact that our map of reality doesn't hold up, and is insufficient. And then that kind of spurs us into this journey. And so like for me, that was the case. It was like I like never had any interest in philosophy, and and then like here I was at 18 grappling with difficult relationship with my father, and like all of the kind of baggage from that. And then I started meditating, and I started getting interested in things like Buddhism. And so it's like I think there's a lot of people who like get into it kind of from an academic point, and then realize when the real stuff in their life presents itself that like how strong their philosophy actually is. But I think that there's a lot more people who get into it precisely because there was a break. And so it's like even though that's painful, there's kind of a blessing in that it's really hard from that place to lose sight of philosophy as a way of life, as Hadot would say. And so I've been thinking a lot about the kind of like crisis to philosophical life, kind of like pipeline portal. And I think that's like so vital to like kind of keep at the top of our mind, because it gives it a embodied, alive sense, which is what it should be. And it like it ultimately is about relationship. I think about like someone like Elizabeth Oldfield from the Sacred Podcast, who defines sin as disconnection. And so if you frame it in that way, it's like kind of the perpetual cycle from disconnection back to connection, and the relational ontology of relationship being primary, and that being what all of these philosophical exercises and ideas are orienting to, is to kind of allow us to remind ourselves of our true nature. But this has been fantastic. I'll pass it back.
I love that phrase, remind. That's lovely because it connects with memory, changes our relationship with memory. We are reminding ourselves in a new way. And it makes me think of the RE in parentheses, which, Hume is all about a return to common life. You return, but it's not the same, and same with Hegel. So that's lovely. It is interesting to think too that philosophy seems to emerge when you realize the map is not the territory. There's a break between the map and the territory. And there's a grief in that. Oh my gosh, I'm stuck in a map and I can't get the territory. There's a grief in that. But there's also a blessing the sooner that happens, right? There can be a certain curse if you don't realize the map isn't the territory until you're 40, right? But again, this is the weird, kind of legacy of religion that's like, hey, suffering's a grace. What? It actually is, because it can make you realize the map isn't the territory. But then, of course, it's like, but then there's a kind of suffering that's not a grace, right? But religion's like, but every suffering could be a grace, depending on your relation to it and how you interpret it. So it's almost like the language of saying suffering is good or bad is inadequate because it seems contingent upon your relation to it and stuff like that. And I think often theologies did have a bit more of a understanding that it's all it depends, which is to be expected if we're dealing with temporal things and healing, right? Like language, like religion often wants to say it depends versus it is, right? And like you could say perhaps self-determining rationality of the Enlightenment is a language of it is, whereas theology is a language of it depends. Ironically, usually the reverse is claimed. Theology says what is, while philosophy is more skeptical. Actually, funny enough, once philosophy was separated from its beauty, mysticism, and became self-determining reason, it became very theological per se, because there seems to be some sort of principle of reality, and then I'll give it to Mr. Kashir, that what you judge is what you become. If you at philosophy judge theology as being arrogant and claiming, to know everything, then funny enough, you actually become a force of claiming certainty at all. You become what you judge. One of the reasons Jesus says don't judge is precisely for your sake, so that you don't become that. And multiply. Judgment also tends to multiply it and make it worse. And so it's very interesting because, again, I think theology and the best forms of philosophy, once they're tied to relationships, openness, vulnerability, beauty, and so forth, the language of it is, it depends. Whereas the problematic ways of thinking is, it is. Because, of course, only God can say it is, right? So the moment you start talking about it is, you're bordering on heresy, right? But the language of depend is also why we can't simply do with it's good, it's bad, never do, never don't. There's a dependency there. But of course, dependency puts you on dependency on what? God. So if you say it depends, well, then you end up in a dependency on God or the beautiful or something higher that you can't bring into your own ego. So you always have to be open to that because your very language and mode of it depends is all predicated upon a dependence of something higher. And if you're not dependent on something higher, you're self-enclosed. And if you're self-enclosed, you're stuck in entropy and auto-cannibalism and closing in on yourself, and you lose the ability to determine timing. If you're closed in on yourself, you can engage in timing, and you're basically then at the mercy of what occurs. That can lead to various problems. There's more to say, but let me pass it to Mr. Kashir, and if anyone has any final things, please. Mr. Kashir.
Yeah, that's really interesting in the context of this whole conversation, that sense of like enclosure versus partial enclosure or openness to the divine. And yeah, it seems obvious in the context of what Michael was talking about earlier, this kind of crisis point, these kind of breaking opens when the containers often are kind of ruptured open, and then there's a kind of great fruit that can come of that, which is like, oh, it doesn't then like reclose, it just, that becomes the open cup. I think what the question that I'm walking in relation to this that's really alive with me is more the perspective of the collective healing and the collective trauma healing. And I've been, in relation to my own journey and also in other people that I've found who seem to have reached a similar place or undergone a similar process, there is a point at which we're no longer processing our own personal grief, but we find ourselves processing collective grief. And that can be something we're connected with directly, your ancestors or your ethnic group or what have you, but it could also be that you just reach a place where you're transpersonally connected with the traumas of history. And it's interesting because it's almost as a consequence of philosophy in the first place that I've been drawn into those territories. Like it's Jordan Peterson's work that made me think, okay, yeah, turning toward and confronting those things is something important to do. And otherwise, why would you do it, right? It doesn't make much sense in the context of most given kind of implicit frameworks today that going and exploring the nature of the Holocaust would be a worthwhile or important thing to do. But I did end up doing that. And yet, there's a big difference between confronting the traumas of the past or the griefs of the past collectively and actually alchemizing that inside of ourselves. And this for me is such an enormous question. It's a big if. It's almost a divine if, because it feels like it requires that ifness of God to be able to even address I mean, for some people, maybe personal redemption is of that same scale. Like maybe for some people, they've led a life that is so fucked up that to be able to feel redemption, to be able to feel a place of like an outpouring of grace or an inflowing of grace that kind of allows the carnage that they carry within them to be transformed, that's the same kind of scale of miracle. But for me, like my personal path, like at this point in my life, it's the collective carnage that feels like that thing for me, and how to, you know, one of my favorite teachers in recent times, Patrick Connor, gives these amazing spiritual transmissions, and much of his philosophy is all about how do you stop being in opposition to darkness, start to bring darkness into light. How do you integrate it into light? And so, like, what does it mean to actually integrate the atrocities of the past, which once you've read about them, start to live inside of your psyche, into light? And so I'm at this crazy juncture right now of like having these literal, you know, corpses in the closet. And I feel like I'm just at the edge point of like, is it possible that like mycelium and mushrooms can start to like grow out of those? Like, can our past be digested within us in such a way that is redeemed and transformed? So that's what I'm walking in this conversation.
No, magnificent. And I've enjoyed it immensely. And what you shared there is very, very important. There's also so if God exists, there's no point at which you can close, but also there's no point at which you must be lost. And I think basically we assume that if you can't close if you can't close your model, then it's lost. The model is useless, right? Because you can't finish it. You can't get the equal sign. So it's all just nonsense, right? God as a variable, means the system never closes, because you can't bring God into the system and God still be God. But God also is an attractor at all points within the system, and thus you never have to be lost. So what theology brings about is a model that never has to be closed, but that doesn't necessarily have to mean that you end up lost, right? Where something necessarily has to be lost. It doesn't necessarily mean something can't be lost, but there's always that point of turning, right? And I think also what you're saying at the end there's the question of, can the corpses come to bring mushrooms with God, and can they come to bear mushrooms without God, right? Those are kind of different questions, or a God kind of variable, right? And you see many of the theologies would be like, well, no, you can't do it unless you have a God variable, right? Because then you couldn't necessarily do it with a God variable, right? Because there would be the possibility of being lost, like necessary possibilities of being lost. And you could never tell which corpses were those necessary. You could never calculate it. And so you could never arrive at it. There just has to be the possibility that you can apprehend without calculating that reality is a place where any corpse can bear mushrooms, or be brought into, where any darkness can be brought into light. If there's some darkness that can be brought into light, then you have to figure out what, and it's in the realm of ego, and rationality dominates, right? Because rationality has to calculate what darkness can be brought into light and what not. And who are you to figure that out? You must be God, right? So if it is not the case that all darkness could be brought into light, even if it's not always, but if it's not possible for all darkness to be brought into light, then it would be human beings who would determine what darkness can and what can't, and we'd have to spend all our time figuring that out. We'd enter into judgment, religious wars, conflicts, disagreements, fight, and we would eat ourselves. So the hope of humanity rests upon the possibility that all darkness can be brought into light. Now, what does that look like, though? Because there is the, well, you know, God, like Ken did, you know, the best of all possible worlds. So God will use this to do X, Y, and Z. But then, of course, you're in the realm of apologetics and it becomes sort of ridiculous in that Voltaire sort of example, right? But then also there's the idea that this is the key with beauty. Beauty can have a strike that in the strike of beauty, it is not that you then rationally understand how all the bodies actually lead to the good, but it is an apprehension of a certain harmony of all the parts that can only be here because all the parts are there, that effuse the whole with a certain experience of gratitude, not in denying the death and the horror, but actually changing your horizon of experience, right? And that's often what happens with healing. You don't see people healed when they can get a rational explanation for why the bad thing happens, right? In fact, that always leads to a certain kind of, oh yeah, okay, well, I can see how that worked for good. All right. But it doesn't, but it feels, but you're trying to have rationality do your healing, because what you're actually doing is using explanation as healing. And the problem is explanation cannot be healing unless we're minds on sticks. Explanation can help, but if you just stay in explanation, it doesn't become full body, right? The weird thing about beauty is in the moment of the ineffable experience of beauty, it has a way of making you experience the beauty of it all without you even necessarily understanding. You just get it. And in a way, it almost has to be that way, because otherwise you would have to case by case go through every single darkness and calculate how it can be brought into light, every single bad thing, and feel and see how it's being worked, and you would never get there. It would eternally regress, right? But in the moment of beauty, there's some impossible to put into words apprehension of the whole as being beautiful. And then you from there can concentrate on the particular people and who God has put in front of you to work healing, work through, having that experience of the beauty, and then working for them with a sense, you know how Christianity and many religions have this emphasis of the already not yet, right? Like, you know, God has won, but already, but not yet, right? Like it's coming, but it's not here. Death has been overcome, but it's also still going on. I think healing actually works in a similar way when you have a certain relation to time as an already not yet, where you've apprehended the whole in the experience of beauty. You've apprehended it in those deep moments, and you know that it is there in the depths of reality itself, but it cannot be calculated except one at a time. And since you can't calculate it all you can do is calculate the particular examples given to you and move them toward that beauty that defines the whole, and trust that if you can move these, that's a testament to the possibility of the whole, even if you never experience the whole thing being brought into final healing. You can trust in that possibility because of the experience of beauty, and then take the individual examples that have been put in your life that are moved in that as holographic, if you will, testaments to what is possible in every point. Because that's the best that can be hoped for with a given individual in a finite frame. And I think that also speaks to how every single individual actually has a certain role of being a healer in their own particular life with the particular traumas that are presented to you, et cetera, so forth. But also too with that, I think when you're talking about collective grief, there's a tradition of a way that grief, there is grief in reality itself. Like reality itself entails grief. It is fallen, quote unquote, right? It came up short. It's not merely that humans fell, but there's a certain sinews of reality that have somehow actually fallen themselves. That grief is in reality itself, which makes sense if grief and relationship goes together. The moment we start saying reality is relational, that relations are ontological, you are saying that the very structure of love and by extension, grief are in reality, right? That reality in its sinews contains the same substance of love and grief and relations all together, of which must be there if there is going to be any possibility of the beautiful in love. And so there's a way also too when you're dealing with collective grief and how like religions have generational curses. There's notions of things passing. There's idea of a people being hurt or God making a people or a people being lost. There's this notion of a certain collectivity that can be talked about when we talk about grief. Well, that makes sense if there's something where grief is in reality. But the key is that grief is in reality because relation is in reality. And relation can be love. But there you go, right? That's why all darkness can be brought to light. That's why all grief can be brought into beauty and love, because grief and beauty and love are all the same thing. They're all sides of the same ontology, right? You feel grief for people you love, not people you don't know. You feel grief and hardship when someone you care about is lost or says something mean to you, right? So like the very thing that is reality entails the substance of grief and trauma and difficulty because it is the substance of beauty and love, right? And so it's only a matter of probability and time that there will be collective traumas precisely because there can be collective beauties, right? And it is simply the working through the process of accepting that collective trauma as part of the process of moving into the collective beauty, that if it was not there, we wouldn't be dealing with reality. So there's a way to, I think when I hear you talk about collective grief and collective trauma healing, there's a way in which you are bringing the personal experience of grief closer to the fact that this is actually not merely a personal matter, but some sort of ontological condition that each individual is participating in. And the more we work to have collective healing, the more you're actually bringing, dare I say, areas of the fabric of reality more toward the relations on the side of beauty, not just toward the side of grief. But the fact that but this is the odd thing, the fact that they are in grief means there's the possibility of them being in love and beauty. Like if you couldn't have them be in grief, well, then beauty wouldn't be in reality. There would just be indifference, right? Like if there was collective indifference, we would be more, dare I say, damned than we would be because there is collective grief. The fact that there is collective grief actually means there's no hope. But the key is actually being aware of that and then working the particular skills, the particular relationships, and the particular processes of individuals to bring that grief to where it then is brought out of, dare I say, devastation, as we were saying, but moving it back toward the beautiful. But this is, again, I guess the final thing I'll say. Religions all warned that this was really only possible in community. Like you really just cannot do this individually. You can have individual hero's journey that may equip you for community because there's two ditches on either side of the road. If you try to do community without working on yourself, it falls apart. But then if you stay in yourself, you can't move into this next level, right? Like if you stay isolated, perhaps you can work on your individual grief. But if you don't move into community, church, relation, synagogue, if you don't move into these things, then you can't work on collective grief per se, and therefore you can't work on the grief in reality. You can't work on the fallenness in reality, only and if you're just dealing with individual healing, it's always fragile. And it's also not going to become a life that is healed, because there's also that question. How do you move from healing to being healed? That almost always has to move from individual to community, because if there's not a community that's healed that you can be in, well, then you're just going to get hurt by your very aloneness. You'll be hurt by your very enclosure, right? So in order for healing to become healed, it has to move into community. It has to move into relationships, because you're also not moving into a place where the grief in reality itself is being worked in, and that will come back only as a matter of time. But I've enjoyed this immensely, Jacob Kashir. Always a pleasure to see you, Mr. Jockin, and I will thank you for your time today. It's always a treat, sir.